Live representative.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. This is the House Committee on General and Housing. And today is Tuesday, January 21. So our first hearing of the day is about Act 250. And we are going to hear from three witnesses, Peter Gill, Chris Cochran, and Kathleen Dimitri. So I think, Peter, you were present when everyone just introduced themselves to our new committee assistant. So I think I'm going to skip with further introductions by the committee. But Peter, would you introduce yourself and state your name and position for the record?
Sure. Yeah, for the record, I'm Peter Gill. I'm the executive director for, the Land Use Review Board. We just transferred from the Natural Resources Board to the Land Use Review Board, which you'll learn about here shortly. And we are housed just down the street on Baldwin. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about the future of land use in Vermont as resulting from Act 181, which was passed last year. We've got myself from the Land Use Review Board perspective, and we have Kathleen Dimitri from the Regional Planning Commissions, and Chris Cochran from ACCD, Agency of Community and Commerce and Community Development.
I mess it up all the time.
And yeah. And I think it's helpful to have all three of us in the room, and appreciate the opportunity to be here to explain this to you all. And I say that it's helpful to have all three of us because we're working very collaboratively in implementing this new law. So with that, let me give you a little bit of an overview of where we're going today. We'll start with a little bit kind of where we've been and where we're going ultimately with the implementation here. We're going to talk a little bit about like what's happening now. This is a long time frame, a long process to roll all this out. You know, what is actually happening right now on the ground? What is active in terms of the legislation now? Then we'll go into kind of the jurisdiction, the tiers, the new criteria that's being applied under this, and talk about the land use maps and the mapping process and the regional plans. And then we'll turn it over to Chris at that point to talk about the designation programs and how those are going to work. So that's kind of where we're going here. How did we get to this new framework of Act 181? Well, there was three major studies that were required by previous legislation. We had a Natural Resources Board report talking about the necessary updates to Act 250, how to make it a more effective law and program. We had the DHCD report 2050, looking at the designations, making those better. And also, lastly, the RPC report, making those land use designations clear in town, municipal plans. And as you can kind of see, these all fit together and work together in this puzzle piece here. So from the Act 250 perspective, I'll start there because that's my organization. It was kind of exciting. We actually have a purpose now. There was not a purpose in Act 250 prior to Act 181. But this purpose is not a surprise, should not be a surprise to anyone. This has been kind of a state goal and policy for quite some time to be looking at our historic settlements and these compact villages and centers, and separating that from our working lands, our enterprise areas, and rural countryside. And so that sort of helps, cement that smart growth idea into our law.
Yes, please go ahead.
So that's purpose statement did not exist before Act 181?
Correct. In Act 250.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you for
So
clarifying.
there was lots of blocks and talk about these types of things within Act 250 and even criteria that address some of these concerns, but never explicitly stated in this way. Again, we're kind of in that umbrella of where are we going with all of this? This slide kind of shows you where we're going in a visual way. You can see, and I'm just going to try to minimize this because it's kind of in my screen. You can see the three different areas that kind of correspond to those studies that we were just talking about. You've got the regional plan, future land use categories on the top slide there, and you can see that I have these very discrete nomenclature there for the areas defined in those plans.
And Peter,
And
are these, you're talking about the regional plan, future land use categories
yeah,
on that slide?
first
Right, okay.
top. Yep.
Now, whose regional plan? Required by what?
So each region in the state, there's 11 regional planning commissions. They each have a regional plan, and they're going to be using this same nomenclature now, whereas before you had kind of various terms within there, and some maybe would be slightly different, and now we have a lot of consistency in the use of those terms there. And we'll hear a little more on those with Catherine in a bit, but
Okay, go ahead.
And then the next row down there is the state designations, so you can see those. Again, kind of where we're going, right, towards this idea of having centers and neighborhoods. So very simple, two designations. Whereas we used to have 5, now we're into 2. Again, you'll hear a little bit more about that from Chris down the road.
And again, Peter, this slide makes it look like the center is coterminous with downtown and village center. Is that correct? And neighborhoods are coterminous with, and both of them planned growth.
Yeah.
And village area.
Yeah, so you can see there's a little overlap.
So there's there's not going to be a designation for transition, enterprise, resource, et cetera, right?
Okay. And then just kind of working our way down that chart, you've got the Act 250 band there. We're going to talk in more detail about all these pieces as well, but you can see that now it's divided into these tiers, tier 1A and 1B, and then tier 2, and then over there on the far side is tier 3.
What does that D stand for? And,
What's that?
never mind.
So tier 1, just to clarify, tier 1, which has, these have to do with exemptions from the regulatory requirements of Act 250. And tier 1 has certain exemptions, which I guess we'll get into. And it covers definitely centers, which in turn means downtown and village center. And it also covers planned growth areas, some planned growth areas, right? And neighborhood, potentially. Okay. I'm
Yeah, so
just making sure that we follow this chart.
Yeah, you can look at it, horizontally and look in each of those sections, and you can kind of look at it vertically as well and kind of see the corresponding pieces there, and you can see where it doesn't always line up exactly. But this gives you a good sense of kind of how these pieces all fit together. And you can see the small note, maybe at the very bottom there. These aren't talking about geographies or how big these particular areas are. These are just to put it kind of in a visual way, so you can kind of see them fit together.
Ashley,
Do you have percentages of Vermont that fall into each category?
No, I don't have that. I don't know if others have.
Okay.
because the mapping isn't complete.
And yeah, and in terms of, right, it specifically in terms of my program with Act 250, those, as you'll learn here in a minute, those statuses or tiers are not, have not been approved by the board. That's going to be all part of this process. Let me move on from that. kind of overview, get that in mind. I think you'll be able to see that slide again later down the road and might make a little more sense as we get further through the process too. Don't have to say too much here. This is landmark legislation. This is a major change for Vermont and how it's looking at its land use regulation. It's kind of chunked, as I said, into different portions and parts. They're not all going to happen right at once. You've got interim, housing exemptions that are happening right now. As of July 1st, we started working on that from the Act 250 side of things. The municipal bylaw preemption for housing that occurred right away as well. We talked a little bit about the regional plans and the updates that are happening there. That's ongoing and happening as well. It's not finalized, of course, yet. And then we're going to get into the designation portions of that and have those layered in. The tiered system of jurisdiction is going to be coming into place. And then further out, you have improvements to our data planning center, making sure we're capturing all this information and can really look at it and folks know where to find that information. And we can make, you all can make policy choices based on that data as well then.
Yes, I have a question so we have the land use review board is going to review and approve the regional plans that have been prepared at the level of the regional planning commissions. Right now, before Act 181, did anyone approve those plans? Okay, so this is new.
So that's a big, landmark.
And say the board doesn't like a plan, can they just revote? Is it sent back to the regional planning commission, or can they de novo change the plan?
So I'll take your phrasing with a little bit of liberty there, but of course, it's not a whether they like it or not, but they look at it, the statutory requirements and if it meets it, doesn't. If it doesn't, I think it's kind of where that's going is then they say, here's where we see it doesn't have it, then they can amend their application back to the board.
It's an application by the regional planning commission for approval of its plan.
Yes.
All right. Meanwhile, while that's going on, there are these Act 250 interim exemptions for Tier 1 and Tier 2, which means that we must know now what Tier 1 is, right?
So two separate systems. Good question. But two separate systems. So kind of down the road, we're looking at those tiers. Right now, we've got interim exemptions. Will there be overlap between some of those areas? Yes, by all means, I think there probably will be. Are they exact? Are they perfect? No.
But Tier 1 is defined in 181. And enough so that we know do we know now what area, if an area is exempt, do we know it?
In terms of Tier 1A or something, the tiers, no. Because that has to go through an approval from the board. So if it meets those statutory requirements, you could, to say a different way, you could piece it together and say, oh, looks like this will probably be in this Tier 1A area. But do you know for certain? No, because you have to have officially approved by the board.
So even the interim exemptions are not effective now. I don't mean they may be legally effective, but as a practical matter,
Effective.
if I'm a developer and I want to develop in excess of the original, under the exemptions, can I apply to a town that's
Yes.
in Tier 1 now?
No application process necessary for the interim exemptions.
Okay, how do I know I'm in Tier 1?
I will get into that. Can I pause it just for a minute?
Sure.
I get the
Okay,
question.
you had a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Lenny.
Yeah, I had a quick question, just.
I like the excitement.
So I'm just trying to understand why it's. Just why it's not obviously well, if you're exempted now, you're obviously gonna be a tier. Is it just because there might be a farm right next to the center or, a Christmas tree or a stable with a couple horses next to the.
On a practical level, I think it's, so the tiered system is based on well thought out, mapping exercises that involve community involvement, et cetera. And so I think that's why you need to kind of have that layer of approval process, et cetera. And we don't know exactly, you have a pretty good idea looking at the statutory language and the requirements. But for certain, no, you've got to have a, public process approval.
To refine it.
To refine it, I think. Yeah, it's probably the best way to say it. Yeah.
All right, that
Let's
approval
just-
process isn't opening us up to stopping all of this though, right? I mean,
I don't think so.
Okay.
So I should have said this right at the get-go. The Land Use Review Board, I think we do get into this a few slides in here, but the Land Use Review Board is not actually seated yet. They will be seated as of this coming Monday. They've been appointed, but they have other jobs. They're winding down their business, et cetera. And they will start this coming Monday. And so they'll have, an opportunity to kind of get more involved in all of this as well.
I'm sorry to have asked so many questions. I think the best thing is to let you go ahead because I have a feeling between the three witnesses, most of our questions will be answered.
I think we're gonna get there, but I again,
I
really,
want to make sure that there's time for each of the three and we don't find, we have to get Catherine next week. Okay, all right.
so, this slide just showing, that there's these four different systems that are really, coming together. You have the municipalities working, in this mix as well, bringing their thoughts and requests up to the RPCs and the mapping process. You have the Community Investment Board that's bringing in the designation and the money that's, going to help support those areas. And you have the Land Use Review Board doing the approval and the review of these maps and the processes. Again, sort of that idea of alignment, right? Last year, this slide would look much different. You wouldn't have a vertical line with, state, regional, and municipalities all kind of aligned in one way in terms of their goals and their plans and their investments, right? Act 181 kind of put all that together and said, hey, we need to be aligned with each of those partners and those groups of ideas together. So that was kind of the preliminary, set the stage, know where we're going with all of this. What are we doing now under this act? Well, the first part is housing exemptions. Second part is bylaw modernization on the municipal level. So kind of two different levels there. First is for Act 250 housing exemptions. So let me go over this in a little bit of detail, but I'm gonna first tell you just a couple resources that we have and we've made available since July 1 to get this portion moving forward. So we have an interim housing exemption guidance. This gives details for folks to understand and know when they would not need an Act 250 permit for the project or when they need to go through our program. There's a map as well that is a companion to that helps to show visually likely areas for the exemptions application. Less refined, I think, than what will be those tiered exemption areas. This is a good indication of not having jurisdiction in those particular areas that are colored on the map. And then, I always tell people to contact the district coordinators. Those are our on the ground folks that work for Act 250 that look at the details of the law and make determinations of whether it applies or not in any given situation. And I sort of skimmed over the purpose statement here, but I think that's kind of important because it's kind of two parts, encouraging housing, which we all recognize as a need in the state. And then kind of getting us towards that tiered system. This was an on-ramp to get us in that mode and understanding of how we could look at the state more on a location-based jurisdiction model rather than the current jurisdiction, which I should mention. And this is maybe a good point, but as you may or may not know, our jurisdiction is based on the acreage, for one, on the acreage of the parcel. that a commercial development is proposed on. So if it's over an acre, then it would require Act 250 jurisdiction unless you're in a town with subdivision and zoning bylaws, in which case it would go up to 10 acres. And also based on the number of units that are proposed in a in a housing development, for example. If you're 10 units, then you would trigger over 10 units, and you would trigger jurisdiction.
Outside of the exemption area.
Yes, so outside of the exemption area and currently under our existing law. So let's go in a little bit more detail in terms of these housing exemptions that were passed by the legislature last year. There's 8 of them. And I kind of break them down into 2 different groups. So I think that's helpful just to be thinking about them. These first ones are location based. So again, that's kind of helping us with that on-ramp idea of getting towards the tier jurisdiction or location based jurisdiction. Starting at the bottom of that list, we've got a transit corridor in certain areas of the state with population density of over 50,000. So that's essentially the Chittenden County area, plus or minus. You've got a quarter of a mile from those transit corridors that have been designated. You can do up to 50 units of housing in those areas. Village centers, same threshold in terms of 50 units. Those are designated areas. You got a quarter mile around those that you're able to build your 50 units up to at this point. Next one is new town growth centers and neighborhood development areas up to 775 units. Downtowns is unlimited number of units. So all those are kind of the location-based areas. The last one, the reason I went reverse order here is because priority housing project is sort of a hybrid between the 2 types. You got the fact that you have affordable housing with that, but you also have within certain locations, certain designation locations for those projects to qualify as what we call priority housing projects.
Just to clarify for the committee. So these projects, any project, all these refer to is how many units can you have in these areas and still not be subject to the whole Act 250 process. You still got to get local permits. It doesn't change anything, right? It's just what's exempt from Act 250. So if for example, East Calais, my little town, is, I think, a village center. So you could theoretically build 50 units if you could find soils we don't have any sewer. You could build 50 units and still 49 units, 50 units and still be exempt from Act 250. If you could, but you'd need a permit, you'd have to find the land and you'd need everything else. Okay.
Yes, that's true. So then that is sort of a hybrid, as I said, because it also has the type, it has to be an affordable housing project. So moving into that kind of second category of those typed ones, there was also 3 other exemptions that were set in Act 181 for immediate. And that was commercial conversion. So taking a commercial use building and converting it into housing, go up to 29 units without an Act 250 permit. It also allowed for accessory dwelling. This is part of that alignment slide that we were looking at before. We had that companion of ADUs in the municipal side, and now we have it in the Act 250 side as well. Last one here is the motel and hotel conversion. So again, taking that space, converting it into a housing space. I was talking about the different resources that we have available. I'm going to keep moving a little bit slower so I don't take up, or a little quicker so I don't take up too much of my companion's time here either. So we've got guidance, looks sort of like this. It's a checklist. People can go through very carefully and easily and kind of make self certifications in essence, whether they meet those exemptions. They're always more than welcome, and we definitely encourage folks to come into our office and talk with our staff to verify whether they meet these or not. But this is a helpful guidance document for them to do that. The other resource I talked about is the maps. This is up in Chittenden County, and I picked that because it's got a lot of the different types of these exemptions right in it, the various colors. correspond to map off onto the side. And I apologize, this is an older slide here. We've got an update of this map, and it'll actually have the color swatches. So if you were in this area here, this is a transit corridor area, that blue will be right up here next to the transit area. So you can kind of match those. You can zoom in, get parcel lines, see your parcel, see if it's in that particular area.
So do I understand that the parcel, that the map, these maps exist? And you can get an exemption based on these maps, but what you're saying is the land use, there will be a process for updating these maps and getting the Land Use Review Board to approve them formally that will define the tiers more precisely.
Yes, in essence, I think of it as two different systems, this being kind of the interim system.
Yeah.
And then the other being the final exemption system. And at some point, again, because these are interim, they will last for a certain period of time, and then everything will be set under the tiers.
You're almost halfway through your hour, just letting you know.
Okay, great, thanks. We'll keep motoring through. So I have slides on each of these exemption areas. What I will point out, we'll make sure you have a copy of these slides so you can look at them in more detail. But what they do is just kind of break out the number of units that you're able to develop in each of these areas. How long those exemptions, as we said, these are interim. So for instance, this one expires in January 1, 2027. Tells you if there's any other particular requirements for it, what locations those are in, right? There was those 5 that are location based. So that is noted in here, and tells you about some of the other requirements, as you'll note here, and you'll see this as I whiz through the slides on this. You know, zoning and subdivision bylaws, something that's repeated. Public sewer, water, soils adequate for waste disposal is another thing you will see repeated in these requirements for these particular areas. We've got our next one here, you've got designated downtowns. Similarly, one thing I will just highlight and note here is you've got river corridors and flood hazard areas unless there's infill. That again is something that's repeated throughout many of these exemption areas. Again, here you've got the 75 unit limit. Again, many of those repeated in terms of locations and requirements of each. Got your designated village centers, certain transit corridors, commercial, and then here's our type-based commercial residential conversions, accessory dwelling units, hotel and motel to affordable housing. As not being a housing or a municipal expert, I'm going to give you a broad brush over here in terms of some of the bylaw exemptions. As you can see on this list, there were several things in Act 181 that were changes to the municipal bylaws section to encourage housing and remove some of those barriers on the municipal side as well. We've got a slide that kind of goes into some of those details. So tiered jurisdiction, this is an area that's a really important part of Act 181 in creating these location-based jurisdiction. Kind of gave you the broad overview of, you got tier 1A, tier 2, and tier 3. Tier 1 is broken into A and B. This is a nice visual because you can kind of see, the more developed areas in tier 1A. You're encouraging growth. These areas have the capacity to review these projects as they're coming in and ensure that they're properly done. Tier 1B, This is encouraging, again, that smart growth housing, encouraging housing in those particular areas. And tier two, you're talking about the status quo. So again, those jurisdictional triggers for Act 250 would apply. There is also the addition of a road rule in that, which essentially says if there's 2,000 feet of roads and driveways with a particular project, then that would trigger Act 250 review. And again, in this area, if you're talking about triggering Act 250, that means, it does not mean that the project cannot go forward. 98% of our projects go forward, and there's, they're generally not denied. I'll say it that way. It's very, very, very small percentage that are denied. So the project can still go forward if it needs an Act 250 permit. The other portion of tier two or status quo areas is there's an addition for a new review criteria within that area. So for forest habitat and forest fragmentation, wildlife habitat. So that would be reviewed only if you're going through Act 250. And then you have tier three to be designated those areas that are critical natural resource areas. Act 250 apply within those particular areas. The details of that would have to go through the land use review board.
I might suggest, given that it's now, we only have about 25 minutes left, that if you feel there are major issues that you haven't touched, let us know. We'll have you back.
Okay, yeah, happy to be back. Yeah,
Okay.
let me go through some, we got more information on tiers there. That's the actual new land. use review board.
We have these slides.
And you have the slides, yeah.
No, we don't.
No,
we
no,
don't.
we're
Just-
not.
Oh,
then
you will have them, you will.
Yes, send them
Yeah.
to Molly. Okay.
That's
So
what I was
I've got
wondering.
it now, I think, to Catherine. Yeah, sorry for going on too
Those are
long.
great,
Thank
great
you.
slides. I wanted to make sure we get them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We got them in wallet size too.
Nice to see all of you again. For the record, I'm Catherine Dimitrick. I'm Executive Director of Northwest Regional Planning Commission. Happy to talk to you more about Act 181, our, almost 200-page bill. So we're doing our best to condense it into this time period for all of you. So I'm going to talk about how this bill changed regional planning. And I will say, I've been at Northwest Regional Planning Commission for 30 years. This is the biggest change to my work that's happened in that 30 years. All regional planning commissions have a regional plan. We always have had regional plans. This bill makes those regional plans really meaningful because they set the stage for Act 250 jurisdiction and they set the stage for what areas of the state are eligible for the state incentive programs. So they really have some fundamental meaning from a policy perspective at the state level. So I'm really excited about what this bill is doing for regional planning. The bill did add an additional goal that requires us to make sure that a substantial majority of our housing can happen in those areas planned for growth, and includes the requirement that we meet environmental justice criteria and principles. It also has some new process requirements. Currently, we always had a hearing adoption process, but the bill made that process much more specific, including requiring us to follow those environmental justice principles, as well as incorporating robust citizen participation and focusing on equity. And as I noted, we all had regional plans before. And if you've looked at your local plan or regional plan, you know that they have a future land use map, which shows on a map what the plan is for the future development or conservation or whatever in between of your community or the region. All 11 of them were different. This bill means that all of them are going to be using the same 11 categories. So you'll be able to knit together on a statewide basis a plan for Vermont that can hopefully not only serve as a policy platform for Act 250 and the designation program, but other things down the road when it comes to where we prioritize sidewalk investment, for example. I mean, there's a lot of ways that we'll be able to use this.
Catherine, a question about the plan.
Yeah.
Well, these land use maps, is there any requirement in Vermont of vertical consistency? In other words, does local zoning have to be consistent with the land use map? And do local permits have to be consistent with land? use
There
map?
is a statutory requirement that local zoning is consistent with the local land use plan. Yes.
And the
there
local
is
land use plan is the basis of the land use map.
Yes, and there is a requirement that regional plans are consistent with local plans and local plans are consistent with regional plans. So there's a back and forth requirement of consistency there. So here it is in visual. So the regional plans and our future land use maps are now going to serve, once they're approved by the State Land Use Review Board, are going to serve as the basis for the state designation and incentive program. So as it exists now, every town has to go through their own application process, do their renewals individually approved by a state board. Now it's all just going to be in the regional plan, and then towns won't have to do anything else. So it won't rely on towns' ability to have the capacity to take this on and get the applications for their property owners to be eligible for these incentives. And then it will serve as the basis for the Act 250 long-term exemption areas, those tiers that we talked about. So here are the 11 land use categories we're all going to be using. And these are highlighted a bit in the visual that Pete showed you earlier in terms of how that transition will go. So I'm going to focus talking about the first four, which are shown in the first three bullets: downtown centers, village centers, planned growth areas, and village areas. One thing I want to note, because I'm not going to talk about it in great detail, is the conservation area, the last land use area here. We'll have those in our regional plans. It is not the same thing as the tier 3. So tier 3 is where there will be potentially some enhanced Act 250 jurisdiction, those super high value environmental areas in the state. That's going to be developed through a whole rulemaking process. It won't be the same as our conservation areas. All right, so let's talk about these areas. So the downtowns, and this is all what's in the statute. So these are the requirements that we're now going to have for.
Catherine, I'm going to interrupt you for just one
Sure.
moment. The two of you. Excuse me for just, I'm
Absolutely.
planning our time, okay? Do we have the ability to have extra time for these people, or how do we do that?
Not today,
Not today.
on Thursday or Friday.
Okay,
I
well,
think we're
let's
gonna be
go.
able to do it.
Okay, let's go.
We're trying to value your
Sorry to
side.
interrupt, but I just wanted to check it out.
Appreciate that.
Larger part, sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
All right, so so the statute lays out a lot of criteria for these land use districts, and the regional planning commissions worked together to develop an even more detailed mapping process that we're all going to use. And so that's adopted among the regional planning commissions. We're all going to follow the same process. So downtowns and village centers, those are really the areas that are the highest dense land uses in your towns. You can think of them. It's where the town office might be, where the church is, maybe if you're lucky, where the school is. There's higher density housing. And those are the downtowns, or be the larger, bigger ones in your communities, and the village centers are the smaller ones. As part of the statutory requirement, the village centers, you don't have to have zoning or subdivision or water or sewer infrastructure. It can just simply be where development has happened in your community historically. Planned growth areas, those are the areas around, most likely, the downtowns. So the downtown is the most dense area. The planned growth areas, all those areas outside of there that help support the downtown, that are the next dense areas of development within the community. In order to be a planned growth area, the community needs to have zoning and subdivision regulations, public water or wastewater, and what's called complete streets, which means there has to be a way for people to get around that's not just cars. It could be sidewalks or paths or public transit. There's a various ways to meet that. And then finally, we have the village areas, which are the growth areas around the village centers. These are the places that are a little less dense in the village center, but still an important part where growth is planned for the community. A requirement for that is that you have to have zoning and subdivision, and you have to have public water or sewer or suitable soils for septic. And there are actual soil maps that can show us, essentially generally where those soils are located. All of these 4 areas that I just described are eligible for what's called Tier 1B. So Tier 1B are those areas in the state where Act 250 jurisdiction won't be triggered unless you're building 50 units or more of housing. So 50 units or less on 10 acres or less, you won't need an Act 250 permit in any of these areas if the municipality opts in. So this is a municipal choice. So the regional planning commissions will work with the towns to map these areas. They'll be mapped regardless of whether a town opts in, but it's going to be up to the legislative body of the town to decide, yes, we want that exemption for Act 250 in our community.
So I might ask, I'm a town, I think from our conversation, there's few in your jurisdiction. We don't have zoning, thank
Right.
you very much. Our feeling is people can do whatever the hell they want to do with their land, okay? You will go ahead and map whether my village areas,
I'll map your village center.
my village center, you'll map that. But if I don't apply for a tier 1B exemption, the price is that somebody can't build more than 10 units on my land without getting an Act 250. They don't qualify for the 50-unit exemption.
That's right, because to qualify for the exemption, you need to have zoning or subdivision.
Right, and my town feels, for whatever reason, I was being a little facetious. For whatever reason, we feel like, who cares? We're never gonna get 50 units anyway. Whatever, we don't opt in.
If you don't opt in, and then you get essentially the same status as a town that opts in who has zoning and subdivision, which is the housing developer goes through one permit process. Because right now in your community, if you build 11 housing units, you would have to go through Act 250.
Right.
In these areas that will now be eligible for tier 1, you would have to get a zoning and subdivision permit and go through Act 250.
But, right, unless, of course, you were exempt and then you,
Right.
okay.
Right, if the town opts in. So the long and the short of it is, even in your community that doesn't have zoning, a housing developer would have one permit process to go through.
Please, go ahead.
This might be a very silly question. What is adequate staff?
That is a great question. So the statute also requires that in order to be eligible for tier 1B and to opt in, you have to have adequate staff to manage your local regulations. We at the Regional Planning Commission level have decided that the judgment that we would use is a self-certification. So when communities are asked whether they want to opt in, we will be asking them to certify that, yes, they believe they have the adequate staff to manage their local permits. Because adequate is really in the eye of the beholder. Additionally, regional planning commissions are making themselves available for technical assistance for communities that do opt in. Were they to get an application that exceeds their normal, 5-hour-a-week zoning administrator, which is adequate, 364 days of the year. Maybe it's not that one time you get the application, we'll be there to assist.
So hypothetically, no one's going to miss an opportunity because they don't have adequate staff.
That is going to be up to the land use review board to decide for sure, but hypothetically, yes. Theoretically, yes.
Okay.
If the municipality believes they have adequate staff, then we hope that will be followed. Right. Yeah. All right, so here's a timeline. So we already developed our mapping standards. We agreed among the regional planning commissions. We got a nice 20-page GIS document of how you map these areas. It works for us, but you don't have to look at it. And then by December of 2026, we're going to all have our regional plans updated. There's a few of us that'll be doing it this year in 2025, and the majority of them will be in the following year. Once we do work on our regional plan, we're going to give the land use review board 60 days advance notice to tell us, oh, you missed this, or we don't think this fits it. So we can make those changes even before we go through the formal adoption process. I think that was one of the questions earlier. And then once we submit it for real, the land use review board would have 60 days to have a hearing, and then another 15 days to give us a decision. And then I just want to show you kind of what this all meant.
I've got to ask you a question. Sorry.
That's all right. I'm trying to.
Can you go back a slide?
Can do.
Do you think you're going to make the December 2026 deadline? The reason I ask is there are people floating around this
Yeah.
building who are wondering whether we should extend the deadlines.
Yeah, right now, the regional planning commissions collectively believe we will meet the deadline.
Thank you.
So we don't see a need for extending the deadline at this moment. Here's what it all looks like in practice on a map. So this is the community of Richford. And I'll orient you just a little bit. Richford is a wonderful community at the Canadian border. And it has in the middle, you'll see that black hash mark. That's the river corridor floodplain. So like many of our communities in Vermont, the river corridor and floodplain goes right through the center of our downtown in Richford. The very dark red in the center is the Richford Village Center. So that's what's currently designated as the Village Center. The interim exemptions are a quarter mile around that designation, which is this hash mark. So that's the quarter mile interim designation. This pink area is where we think we're going to map the village area, which is also going to be eligible for the long-term exemptions to Act 250. So you'll see this, because it was just a quarter mile, it took into some of those areas that probably don't make sense to be a growth area, but it also left out a lot of ones that we think we're going to add right back in. So long-term, overall, the area eligible for exemptions is going to grow in the community of Richford. And the relation to the floodplain here is because we are concerned about encouraging growth in floodplains. Most likely when we're done, the area that's within the red, where you want the highest growth, that will still be eligible for the exemption because Richford has flood bylaws that manage that growth. But these areas here will not be eligible for the exemption. So we don't want to hamper what's already there, but we don't want to encourage more as the overall approach to it. So that's what it might look like in the end, and just give you a relation of how that what's there for the interim now might relate to the long term.
Can I ask a general?
Do you want to ask her or Chris?
No, I have a general question about Act 181. Does it touch current use at all?
No.
Thanks.
It touched plenty of things.
The question is, well, just kind of a general one. One of the things that's been brought up to me was the kind of, if you were kind of doing an overlay map of what we're thinking of will be our tier 1A kind of areas, you can kind of do an overlay map of sewage overflows too, and partially disinfected, untreated, running the gamut of everything from pretty well fully to raw sewage. And I know that's not this, but where does that stopgap kind of like ensuring that we're not saying this is where you want to build, even though you're having 5, 6, 7 discharges every year with your current residences on board?
I think that's a great question, and that's an important point to make. Nothing in the Act 250, nothing in the change to Act 250 jurisdiction changes the jurisdiction for other permits. So you will still need to get a stormwater permit. So any new growth in those areas that are currently experiencing those overflows will need to get a stormwater permit and will need to meet all the requirements, so at least it doesn't exacerbate the condition that already exists.
Okay, it's just trying to find that parity between creating this exemption to say build, build, build.
Yeah.
And people looking and saying we're barely containing what we have.
Yeah. And most of that is because of the stormwater runoff. That's why it happens. And so because they will still need to get stormwater permits, that question will be addressed for subsequent development in those areas.
So you could have a tier 1A area that isn't suitable for any new housing.
You could have a tier 1A area that is in a place where they occasionally have sewer overflow. Yes. When that is built, they'll need to meet the stormwater permit, which would require that there's no additional stormwater overflow that happens in that area. So it won't make the problem worse. It won't solve it, but it won't make it worse.
Debatable, but yes.
So,
I mean, all of it's in theory anyway.
Yeah, adding more houses to a sewage plant.
yeah,
We were looking earlier at some slides that indicated that certain areas where there were floodplains or flood issues would only be exempt if there was infill. Infill is a tricky option because you still have to go through what ANR or deal with wetlands or all of the other criteria. So it might be available
It might be
Yeah.
available.
if it can be infilled.
And that's why we're generally, I mean, it's going to be a case by case basis for each community, but the general approach that we're going to follow when we map these areas is that floodplains and river corridors in those higher developed really dense centers of towns would be considered an exemption area because any development there is going to be retrofitting, which will hopefully make it better.
Mhm.
And then the other areas we would not include in the exemption for that very concern.
Okay, all right. So I'm thinking of low-lying areas
Yeah.
in the bill is centered.
Yeah.
There's-
Thank you. I think, just to clarify for the committee, and perhaps you might want to comment on this when you sit down. This whole thing is about Act 250 and about what's exempt and what isn't exempt under Act 250. Regardless of the mapping, tell me if I'm right, regardless of the mapping, as of now, all the other permit requirements of the state apply.
Absolutely.
And if we wanted to address regulatory reform to facilitate housing more, we have to address that issue. It's not in Act 180. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
And municipal permits.
Thank you.
So if you need a wetland permit, even if you're an exemption area, you're still getting a wetland permit.
Well, we have 7 minutes. We run this committee on time, right?
I'm very glad you run a tight ship, sir, Mr. Chair. I love a challenge, and my name is Chris Cochran. I'm from the Department of Housing and Community
Chris,
Development.
we can have you back if there's a problem.
I think I'm going to call an audible and to change up my message here.
Okay.
So you've heard a lot. It is a lot. It's very complicated. The last time I was here, I was told a lot of the work our group does is system change, and system change takes a long time to implement. We've been working at this conversation, hoping to have this conversation for at least 10 years. So we're finally here. It's very exciting. At this very high level, what these various bills have been doing these past few years is working to align local regulations to enable housing, which was the Home Act that allowed the construction of higher density housing within areas that have sewer and water services. Because prior to that, municipalities often made it very difficult to build in these areas where the investment was. It's cheaper to build the housing in areas where you have this infrastructure, and it's very limited across the state. The state was not getting a good return on its public investment, especially during a housing crisis. So we had to loosen that up at the local level. And the other constraint is Act 250. Act 250 was the triggers were based on the intensity of the development or the acreage of the development. And that was very difficult when you're trying to build in compact areas where you had a lot of neighbors nobody likes change, it's hard. But we needed to be able to open up these opportunities in sewer and water service areas and make it easier from the Act 250 level for these projects to proceed because we have a housing crisis and need it. So it's very high level. We're aligning our local regulations with Act 250. And the part I'm involved with is that's all well and good, regulations, aligning them, making them easier and more predictable. But fundamentally, housing is expensive to build. So without public investment, without incentives to make the housing happen in these locations, it was very hard to make happen. So the programs that I run are these state designation programs I talked to you briefly about. There were a bunch of different designations over the years, 5. It got very burdensome, very confusing, very difficult for us to administer, for communities to make the application. We were getting tired of it. So we did a reset 2 years ago, feels like 2 years, maybe it was a year ago. We hired an external consultant, Smart Growth America, a Smart Growth Advocacy Group with a local partner to do a big engagement process for how do we improve our state designation programs and make them easier. We collapsed our 5 different designation programs down to 2. My board, formerly known as the Downtown Investment Board, spent all of its time, and I spent a lot of time picking boundaries for communities, deciding what is in and what is out for the purposes of benefits. The RPCs were already doing this process. It seems stupid to have multiple processes trying to do the same thing. And we needed to use our time to help communities do projects, to help them get things done. So we glommed onto the RPC process, which is now will be standardized and consistent statewide. We don't need to do boundaries anymore. The RPCs have this map in their process. They will do this. The Land Use Review Board will review and approve their maps. And it frees us up to provide training and technical assistance for communities to help get the projects done, particularly around housing. Let me do this. While it does feel very complicated what is happening, I think over time it'll be much more clear and easy and predictable because you'll look at it's a location and therefore it's treated differently. Whereas before jurisdiction was hard, it was always uncertain. You would have to call a district coordinator, you would have to hire an attorney, you would have to do a lot of things to do just to determine if you were Act 250 triggered or not. That got very complicated and burdensome. So this overall, this location-based jurisdiction, if you were in an area with sewer and water, if you were in an area designated for growth, you are not going to be subject to Act 250. To the chair's point, there's a whole bunch of other permits that still do make it very hard to develop. And there's still opportunities, I think, to use this land use framework to kind of, and planning to kind of pre-clear these permitting processes. So we know that if somebody wants to build something here, the community has made a decision. You won't run into a long appeals process. It won't be complicated and time consuming. You know, the housing can go here to what thresholds, and we can get this done together. That said, I'm going to jump to my slides.
Aw.
I'm sorry. You'll get them. I can come back if you want, but another key change I think that is important to me is, you know, I'm from the Agency of Commerce. We don't do regulations. What we try to do is investments to support our communities and their community development. So when we retired the downtown board, we actually expanded the board to include people with money and economic development experience. So we added an RPC rep, regional planning, RDC rep to the board because they are good at economic development. We added a representative for diversity. So we added Kevin Chu. Kevin Chu coincidentally is part of the Vermont Futures Project. And he's very interested in getting us 802, 100,000 people in this state. I don't know where you got that number. Michael Gowan from the Bond Bank knows finance, knows municipal bonds, knows how to make these things work. And then our treasurer, Mike Pichek. Rather than choosing boundaries, our board is going to be a new platform for how do we support and make investments in these communities to make these projects happen. That said, Act 181 was a big change. A major benefit of the designation was regulatory relief for affordable housing projects. Because we've changed all that, we've made housing more permissive across the board. We've leveled the playing field for all types of housing. The regulatory relief that was given our designated communities through Act 250 is effectively moot. It's not gone away, but it's watered down. This is why we were asked to create a report with the HCB, the Land Access Opportunity Board, VHFA, Vermont Housing, VHCB, I'm getting all my alphabets. Maura Collins, Polly Major, the Land Access Opportunity Board and DHT came up with this report of recommendations. We called it the short report. It's a short report because we want to make sure that affordable housing is still built in these centers. We do recommend additional changes to ensure that that can happen. And we've got some good ideas and we'd love to come back to talk to you about that. Last thing, you know, I jokingly call this the Rosetta Stone. We did use different terms to talk about the same things, but this is a pretty helpful guide for you to line up what we're doing and see how they interrelate. And I think I'm going to leave it there. I think I got you out on time.
Yeah, you did it.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I know there's going to be more, but thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank all of you for giving us this quick tutorial. Much appreciated.
Question.
Yes, this is questions for you. And then here's our names. You know, if you want us back, we'd be happy to come back.
We know how to find you. I think what we're going to do is take a 5-minute, please, 5-minute break for the committee. In fact, get the committee to break. So when we're going to come back here at 2:05, you have time to run. Thank you.
Oh, wait.
You don't get built there.
You might want to stop right.
Have your,